never forget the road trip I took with my friends back in the summer of 2018. We were all in college, and it was that perfect time in life when you feel invincible. There were 4 of us: Matt, Sarah, Jenna, and me, Jake. We decided to drive cross-country from California to New York, taking the scenic routes and avoiding the main highways as much as possible. We thought it would be an adventure, and we were right, just not the kind we had hoped for. We set off in my old but reliable 2005 Honda CR-V. The first few days were amazing. We laughed, sang along to the radio, and stopped at every quirky roadside attraction we could find. It wasn't until we reached the remote areas of New Mexico that things started to get weird. We were on a desolate stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. No cars, no houses, not even a gas station for miles. It was late afternoon and the sun was starting to set. We had been driving for hours and we were all getting a bit restless. That's when we saw the sign for a small town called Saguaro Springs. According to the sign, it was only 15 miles off the main road, so we decided to make a detour and find a place to crash for the night. As we turned onto the narrow road leading to Saguaro Springs, the atmosphere immediately changed. The trees seemed taller and more sinister, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. The air felt thick and heavy, almost like we were driving through a fog, but there wasn't any. We joked about it at first, calling it the spooky road, but deep down, I think we all felt a bit uneasy. When we finally reached the town, it was like stepping back in time. The buildings were old and weathered, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. We found a small motel on the edge of town called the Desert Rose Inn. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the parking lot was empty except for a few dusty cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. We checked in and were greeted by an elderly woman at the front desk. She had a kind smile, but her eyes were vacant, almost like she was looking right through us. She handed us the keys to our rooms 5 and 6, and told us breakfast would be served at 7 a.m. sharp. That night, we decided to explore the town a bit. It was eerily quiet, and the only light came from the flickering street lamps. We walked past a diner, a general store, and a church. All of them were closed and looked abandoned. As we walked, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Sarah kept turning around, convinced she saw someone out of the corner of her eye, but there was never anyone there. We headed back to the motel and tried to get some sleep. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Jenna talking in her sleep, but when I turned over, I saw she was fast asleep. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall, and what I heard chilled me to the bone. It was a low, growly voice, repeating the same phrase over and over.
Leave before it's too late. Leave before it's too late.
I woke Jenna up and we rushed to Matt and Sarah's room. They were already awake, looking just as terrified as we were. Matt said he had heard footsteps outside their window, and Sarah swore she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. We decided we had to get out of there, so we packed up our things and went to check out. The front desk was empty, but the old woman's chair was still rocking back and forth like she had just been there. We left the keys on the counter and bolted for the car. As we drove out of town, the sense of fear lifted, but we all were still on edge. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next town, hours later. We found a gas station and went inside to get some coffee and calm our nerves. The cashier noticed how shaken we looked, and he asked if we were okay. We told him about our experience in Saguaro Springs, expecting him to laugh it off or tell us we were imagining things. Instead, His face went pale, and he shook his head.
"You kids are lucky to be alive,"
he said.
"Saguaro Springs has been abandoned for over 50 years. There's nothing there but ghosts and bad memories."
We didn't know what to say. It didn't seem possible, but we all knew what we had experienced. We got back in the car and drove in silence for a long time, each of us lost in our thoughts. None of us could explain what had happened, but we all knew we had encountered something truly terrifying. To this day, we don't talk about that night. It's like an unspoken pact between us. We finished our road trip, but the carefree joy we had felt in the beginning was gone. We were changed by that experience, bonded by a shared horror that we would never forget. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road in the middle of nowhere and you see a sign for Saguaro Springs, do yourself a favor and keep driving. Some detours are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just the two of us, me, Mark, and my best friend Owen. We had planned this road trip for weeks, mapping out every stop, every diner, and every little roadside attraction along the way. We were headed to a cabin in the woods, far from the chaos of the city. It was our chance to disconnect, unwind, and catch up. But from the moment we hit the road, things started to feel off. It began with the weather. The sky was a dull gray, thick clouds hanging low like a heavy blanket. The forecast had promised clear skies, but by the time we left, a light drizzle had begun to fall. I brushed it off as bad luck, but Owen looked uneasy. He kept glancing out the window, mumbling about how the rain made the world look different, almost like it was hiding something. About an hour into our drive, we hit a long stretch of road surrounded by dense woods. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches intertwining above, blocking out what little light was left. The GPS signal was lost, leaving us with only the printed map we had as a backup. We were driving blind, relying on old paper directions and gut instinct. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the rain turned into a heavy downpour. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. It was then that we saw the first sign of trouble, a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering. We slowed down, our headlights illuminating a woman in tattered clothes. She looked like she had been through hell, her hair a tangled mess and her eyes wide with fear. Owen insisted we stop to help her. I wasn't so sure, but I couldn't leave her out there in the storm. We pulled over and she stumbled towards us, her lips quivering as she thanked us for stopping. She said her name was Ava and that her car had broken down further back. She needed a ride to the nearest town. We let her in and the car immediately felt colder. Ava didn't say much during the ride. She just stared straight ahead, occasionally glancing back as if she was afraid of something following us. Owen tried to make small talk, but she only responded with short, clipped answers. There was something unsettling about her, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After what felt like hours, we reached a small, dilapidated gas station. Ava insisted she get out there, despite there being no signs of life around. She thanked us again and vanished into the rain. Owen and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we decided to press on. We didn't want to be out on that road any longer than necessary. As we continued, the rain let up, but a thick fog rolled in, making it even harder to see. We both were on edge, the eerie silence between us only broken by the occasional creak of the car. That's when the strangest thing happened. The radio, which had been nothing but static, suddenly came to life. A voice, faint and crackling, whispered our names. First mine, then Owen's. We both froze, staring at the radio in disbelief. "Turn it off," Owen said, his voice trembling. I reached for the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, more insistent, repeating our names over and over. Finally, I started pounding on the radio, and suddenly it fell silent. We drove in silence for a while, both of us too scared to speak. The fog was getting thicker, and we could barely see the road ahead. My eyes were burning from straining to see through the gloom when I saw it. A dark shape in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, and we skidded to a stop just inches from the figure. It was Ava. She stood there, her eyes empty, her mouth formed into a horrible, creepy smile.
"You shouldn't have left me,"
she whispered, her voice echoing in the car.
"You shouldn't have left me alone."
Before we could react, she lunged at the car, her face pressed against the windshield, her eyes filled with rage. Owen screamed, and I floored the gas pedal, swerving around her and speeding down the road. But no matter how fast we went, she was always there, a shadow in the fog, keeping pace with us. The car's engine roared, the tires screeched, but Ava's figure never wavered. It was like she was part of the fog, always just a step behind us. We didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. We just kept driving, praying that the nightmare would end. Finally, we saw the lights of the cabin through the trees. I don't know how we made it, but we did. We stumbled out of the car, breathless and shaking, and ran inside, slamming the door behind us. We locked every window, every door, and huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep. But the cabin wasn't safe. Throughout the night, we heard footsteps outside, voices in the dark, and the sound of someone scratching at the windows. Every time we looked, there was nothing there, but we knew she was out there, waiting for us. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the sun was shining. It was like nothing had happened, like the nightmare was just a bad dream, but Owen and I knew better. We left that cabin as soon as we could. We were both in shock about that night, and we barely spoke about it on the way back home. Years have passed since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that she's out there, somewhere. Every time I drive through the woods, I feel like I see her face in the trees, her eyes watching me, and I feel that one day she'll come back for us, because some things, once encountered, never let you go. I'm not one for road trips, but my friends managed to rope me into one last summer. They were all about adventure, exploring unknown places, and bonding over campfires. Me? I like the comfort of my own bed and the predictability of my daily routine. But peer pressure is a powerful thing, so I found myself packed into my friend Jeff's beat-up old van, heading off into the wilderness for a week-long trip. The first couple of days were pretty standard. We hit up some tourist spots, camped out under the stars, and even managed to find a hidden waterfall thanks to Julia's impressive map reading skills. By the third day, we were all feeling pretty confident in our ability to navigate the backroads and find hidden gems off the beaten path. That's when we decided to take a detour. Jeff had heard about this old abandoned town called Silent Pines. It wasn't on any of the maps we had, but according to some forum he'd been lurking on, it was a real ghost town, complete with crumbling buildings and an eerie atmosphere. Naturally, everyone was on board, and I didn't want to be the buzzkill, so I went along with it. We drove for hours, the road getting narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. Our phones lost signal, so we also had no more GPS. It felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere. Just when I was about to suggest turning back, we saw it. a rusty, old sign barely visible through the trees that read Silent Pines, population 0. The town was everything you'd expect from a place abandoned for decades. Houses with broken windows, overgrown yards, and an unsettling silence that seemed to swallow our footsteps. We decided to split up and explore, because that's what you do in horror stories, right? I paired up with Julia while Jeff and his girlfriend Emily took off in another direction. Julia and I wandered through a couple of houses, finding nothing more than dusty furniture and the occasional animal nest. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to focus on the thrill of exploration. Then we found the church. It stood at the center of town, a looming structure with a spire that seemed to pierce the sky. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Rows of wooden pews lined the church, and an altar stood at the far end, draped in a tattered cloth. "Creepy," Julia whispered, her voice echoing in the empty space. We walked down the aisle, our footsteps muted by the thick layer of dust on the floor. As we approached the altar, I noticed something odd. A book lying open on the lectern. Its pages were yellowed with age, and strange symbols covered the parchment. It didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. "What do you think this is?" I asked, tracing a finger over the strange markings. "No idea," Julia replied, "but it's given me the creeps. Let's go find the others." As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. "Okay, this isn't funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Julia shook her head, her face pale. "I swear I didn't do anything." We tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in and we pounded on the wood, shouting for Jeff and Emily. No response. The silence was overwhelming, pressing in on us from all sides. I felt like I was suffocating, my heart pounding in my chest. Then we heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like someone muttering just out of earshot. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Julia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with words I couldn't quite understand. It felt like they were crawling under my skin, burrowing into my mind. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. Then, as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. The door creaked open, and a rush of warm air flooded the church. We bolted outside, not stopping until we reached the van. Jeff and Emily were already there, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. "What happened to you guys?" Jeff asked, his voice shaking. "We got trapped in the church," I said, gasping for breath, "and there were these whispers." "We heard them too," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were in the schoolhouse. It felt like they were trying to tell us something." We didn't stick around to find out what. We piled into the van and drove out of Silent Pines as fast as Jeff could manage. No one spoke for a long time, the weight of what we'd experienced hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally started to relax and talk about what happened. Jeff turned on the radio, trying to break the tension, but all we got was static. He flipped through the stations, but it was the same on every channel. "What the hell?" Jeff muttered, giving the radio a frustrated thump. Then we heard it again, the whispering. It came through the static, faint but unmistakable. It was the same voice, the same unintelligible words. I felt a cold chill run down my back. "Turn it off," Julia shouted, and Jeff quickly complied. We drove in silence after that, the only sound the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. We didn't stop until we reached the next town, and even then, none of us wanted to talk about what had happened anymore. It's been months since that trip, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed us back. I hear random whispers in the dead of night, see shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I've tried to tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I feel like it's not over. We disturbed something in Silent Pines, something that doesn't want to be forgotten. And now, it's a part of us, whispering in the dark, waiting for the moment when we let our guard down. I don't know what it wants, but I'm afraid we'll find out sooner or later. Until then, I keep the lights on at night and try to ignore the whispers, but they're always there, reminding me of the terror we unleashed on that disastrous road trip.